high craft and exquisite spatulas, destroying the barriers that separate us from art and from each other, by Mike Craighead. Part 2 of 3. This is a short audiobook cut into podcast-sized slices. It's my statement about art and how I think it works and why it's so important, but it's also a call to action for all of us to slightly shift the way we look at art, along with everything else humans do well, in a way that just might bring us all a little closer together. Visit lowarthighcraft.com for print versions, audiobook, ebook, and all kinds of other things. Chapter 3. Embracing Technology. Art is anything you can do well, anything you can do with quality. Robert Pirsig, NPR interview, 1974. He who works with his hands is a laborer. He who works with his hands and his head is a craftsman. He who works with his hands and his head and his heart is an artist, probably someone other than St. Francis of Assisi, but no one really knows for sure. A real work of art destroys, in the consciousness of the receiver, the separation between himself and the artist, nor that alone, but also between himself and all whose minds receive this work of art. In this freeing of our personality from its separation and isolation, in this uniting of it with others, lies the chief characteristic and the great attractive force of art. Leo Tolstoy, What is Art? 1899. Author's note. Chapter 3 is where I found a way to articulate a few things to myself, turning them from vague suspicions into things I think are very true. I believe that looking at the world with this stuff in mind makes it just a little better. Art is everything. What about craft? The Greeks used the same word for art and craft and skill and knowledge, calling it all techne, and I think that's just great. Can we bring that back? Have you ever held a top-quality chef's knife, or a truly well-made guitar, or a perfectly balanced, top-of-the-line hammer? I think anyone with a pulse can appreciate fine craftsmanship, but if you play guitar, or if you're a chef, or you swing a hammer all day, you'll deeply appreciate the artistry and the design and the execution of the tool of your trade. And I think that's just a different flavor of the resonance we can feel with any object, whether it's art or craft. I'm no historian and much less an etymologist, but here's how I understand it. Several hundred years ago, some medieval or Renaissance pinheads got together and drank a bunch of mead or whatever and decided we needed a bunch of different words to say what techne used to say all by itself. And over time, art and craft and skill and knowledge evolved into separate concepts to such a degree that art became absurdly elevated above craft and skilled trades, and art that had a utilitarian purpose wasn't really art anymore. And hierarchical labels like high art and low art and folk art managed to color how everyone looked at everything. Then the pinheads had way more mead and decided to break the arms off all their statues. And no, I will not be accepting corrections on any of this. I think it was a mistake to make these distinctions. They've hurt us much more than they've helped us over the years, and I think we should make every effort to erase them. Is an object made by an artist or an artisan or a crafter? I don't care. For me, it's never about how much time was spent on it. It's not the technique or the medium or the label we've assigned to it. Does it strike me in that indefinable way that makes me keep looking? Does it resonate? That's all I ask of it. I also believe that almost any human endeavor can be placed on the same continuum, containing art and craft and skill and play and work of nearly any description. There's poetry in baseball, and lyricism in computer programming, and grace in construction. The magic might just be harder to see if you're not pre-tuned or receptive to it. The only real difference between these endeavors and more overtly artistic ones are the gatekeeping mechanisms. You need to know the rules before you can fully appreciate baseball. You need to speak a programming language to appreciate programming. You need to understand something about physics and materials and tools and design to appreciate construction. Through learning and curiosity and sometimes just exposure to new things, we can intentionally tune ourselves so that we can vibrate at a wider variety of frequencies, just like any musical instrument is tuned. Some things come naturally, as in, I love this, what the hell is it? And some require adjustment for resonance. The viewer's perspective on the work can evolve for many different reasons. There's a building in my town with a set of downspouts, literal pipes coming from the rain gutters. These have angled joints that bend in and out as the pipe snakes down the geometry of the exterior wall, and the welds joining them are drop-dead gorgeous. While in welding forums, they talk about striving for a stack of dimes pattern, the welds on these downspouts are like tiny little beads of metal in a neat little row. There's not a grinder mark to be found. Those are the hallmark of my own shoddy workmanship in this field. If you've ever wielded welding gear, you might have an inkling of the countless hours of experience required to execute something that elegant. I walk past that, I appreciate the labor, and I'm a little bit proud of the person that did that work. And it gives me the exact same feeling I get when I see a painting I like. In this case, I don't know who did the work, but it still resonates with me. If forced to explain why it resonates, I suppose I'd say the magic aspect of it is probably low and the craft or skill involved is high, but ultimately it doesn't matter. What's important is that pipe is doing its job and it's going to last and it's done perfectly and it's beautiful. I think it's helpful to adjust the way we look at great work, to recognize that the resonance between artist and art and audience is functionally identical to the resonance between craftsperson and work and viewer, or technician and product and user, or any other similar combination of labels. The specifics are irrelevant. What matters is quality, and that's what we should be celebrating as we enjoy the brain tickles it provides. St. Francis of Assisi, or whomever actually came up with the cool quote at the start of this chapter, defined folks as laborers or craftsmen or artists depending on their use of their hands and heads and hearts. I like that because it works to blur the boundaries of good work. It allows for anyone to be an artist who is working with their hands, head, and heart in harmony, regardless of the nature of their actual work. A welder can just use their hands with little skill or care, or they can use both their hands and their head to do something skillful but boring, or they can add their heart into the mix and create something greater than the sum of its parts, something that resonates, art. Strict labels are where the division sneaks in, so I don't like them much, but I do like the idea of separating the category of work from its quality. Labor can resonate, and art can fall flat. It's all about its resonance and its techne, not just its label. There's room for magic in almost everything, even those damn make-us-cry TV commercials. Propaganda is usually dismissed as a cynical enterprise, but if it has some magic woven through it, it's gonna work better, and I don't think we can dismiss it as easily. Even a nefarious agenda can be made magical, and therefore scarier, by a gifted creator. They have to work much harder to include magic in a medium like advertising, which has been cursed by decades of weaseliness, so that the odds are against anything of quality being achieved there, but those odds are being beaten every day by folks who are very good at what they do. Usually a commercial won't resonate with us like our favorite movie might, but to say it's impossible to do great work there or anywhere else is to pretend there's a whole lot less great work in the world. Why do that? Art is community. We've talked about art as communication, but why are we so enamored with this pursuit of creator, work, audience, magic? There's plenty of science to support the idea that as a species, we require community to survive. I think it's a deep tribal need that makes us reach out and communicate through language, of course, but also, and perhaps more profoundly, through nonverbal methods of communication, most obviously in art and entertainment. I believe that any human endeavor that resonates does so because it effectively communicates to its community. Think about your favorite concert. How much of the enjoyment, the magic, was because of the band and the music? And how much was because of the audience, the little community that was sharing that moment with you? It's impossible to quantify, but the point is that music brings us together like nothing else can. And I think the biggest reason it tickles our brains so effectively is the feeling of community we get from it. We feel connected to others who like the thing we like, especially when we're all experiencing it at the same time. Fire up your favorite evil interweb net search robot and type in physiology of, then finish your query with watching sports or playing sports or watching movies or going to concerts. You'll find lots of science about how it all makes us feel better, literally improving our health. Activities like this can boost our mood, help our anxiety, and reduce symptoms of depression. I think that's because these activities reinforce our sense of being part of a community, fulfilling what might very well be our deepest physiological and psychological need. Now, return to the evil interwebnet search robot, and this time look up the physiology of making art, or learning an instrument, or crafting, or hobbies. You'll find just as much science with all the same health benefits. While these aren't directly communal activities, I think their benefits are still related because we are our own audience when we're alone and creating something, and we're particularly susceptible to the resonance in our own work. Sometimes we make things in order to connect with ourselves or with another specific person, and our audience of one is the whole reason we're creating the work. It's a love letter that turns into a song, or a painting of or for our muse or crush or friend or foe, or a book written for an imagined ideal reader, or even a journal entry meant for no one but ourselves. After the work is created, it may or may not find a wider audience, but its creation was still about pursuing connection, regardless of the eventual scale or scope of that connection. We've attempted to communicate with ourselves or someone else or lots of other people because we are hardwired to do just that. Non-performance work is tapping into the same vein as performance, resonance, and connection. They may have nothing else in common except a momentary shared experience, because that's all we humans need to create magic. Interestingly, your favorite evil interwebnet search robot won't help you find too many studies about quality workmanship, as in what doing a stellar welding job or writing an elegant piece of computer code does to your brain. I assume that's because studies of those activities, and therefore their web results, are skewed by commerce. Most of these studies are focused on how a happy work environment might result in a more productive worker, not how a more productive or highly skilled worker is happier because of what they're making or doing. But I'd wager that if you were to fund a study where they stick electrodes onto the skull of a really great welder or coder and make the scientists watch that welding/coding brain while it worked on making something great, the results would match right up with similar studies performed on sculptors and musicians and pitchers and dancers and runners and actors and gymnasts and quarterbacks. That's because all of these activities are just different ways to access the exact same thing. There are even studies which suggest that our heart rates synchronize as we watch things together. Groups of people watching movies, sports, concerts, etc. can experience physiological synchrony, during which our various tubes and circuits and whatnot start blooping along in relative harmony. How cool is that? And what better evidence do we need that humans are fundamentally wired to be in community with other humans? Even if you're not fond of a particular musician, you'll likely have a great time at their show surrounded by their fans. Hey, why don't you go attend a concert right now? I'll wait. Oh, okay, I see you've returned. That was fun, right? There's nothing like the feeling of being among dozens or hundreds or thousands of people, all singing and or dancing together. Nothing moves us and resonates more loudly than music, precisely because of the sense of community surrounding it. That's why religion leverages music so effectively. It's delivering community, a fundamental human need, and the dogma can ride in on the music's coattails. I'm sure the loudness factor still holds true here. This synchrony is probably less obvious or maybe even less likely when faced with quieter resonance of the sort we feel with visual art or quality workmanship, but it's all relative and related. It's the community aspect of art, the drive to experience resonance together. It's most accessible in performance art, quieter in visual art, and even more subtle in other disciplines, but it's woven right into our bones and into our work. Art is service. It's true that a lot of folks get into art, and in particular entertainment, for attention. It's a way to reach out to random people, to strangers, and we might do that for 1,000 different reasons. Ask any stand-up comic for their origin story, and they'll probably tell you it came from trauma. They were trying to make their parents laugh so they wouldn't cry or fight, or maybe they were class clowns always seeking attention and validation. But after a certain point, attention as motivation falls short, and it's not enough. Naturally, when someone does well at something and gets validation for it, they'll steer into that pursuit and do it more and get better. They may even become downright famous for it, but unless you're a real pinhead, if you really stick with something, at some point it's hard to avoid reaching a much deeper level of understanding. You'll value the work to a much higher degree so that it's not just about being famous anymore. It's far more about the work and far less about you. At that point, I think it becomes more an act of service than a ploy for attention. Bruce Springsteen and Taylor Swift both deliver famously long concerts, between 3 and 4 hours in length. I've heard Bruce talk about playing live shows because of that one couple way up in the nosebleed section who had to pay a babysitter and save up for the tickets and maybe get a hotel room or even a plane ticket in order to see the show. Bruce wants to give those folks their money's worth, so he's going to play until he drops. I imagine Taylor plays so long for similar reasons, possibly even to a similar theoretical audience member. That's dedication, gratitude, generosity, and certainly a stellar work ethic from Springsteen and Swift, but it's not quite what I'm talking about when I say service. When the artist and the work and the audience are in the middle of the magical resonance that happens when all the parts come together, the experience becomes far greater than the sum of those parts. I've personally felt this at concerts I've attended, and also when I'm playing music for others. We're all suddenly in this momentary community. It's humbling and enormous and so much bigger than me that the applause at the end almost feels out of place. You're making this thing because it's important. Then you're sharing this thing because it's important that it be shared. And it stops being about you. It's become a service to other people. I don't doubt that these moments occur multiple times during a performance by Taylor or Bruce, but they occur during specific moments of resonance between the artist and song and audience, which can only happen when the artist is really living in the moment and the communication is loud and clear and the audience is resonating on the same wavelength. It's both magical and indescribable, and the artist is performing a service in that moment, separate from and bigger than any benefit they might derive from it. A top-level chef literally serves food, but they can also aspire to elevate the experience of a guest at their restaurant, truly providing an experience that nurtures as it nourishes. With the right touch, the plate becomes far bigger than its creator, and when their literal act of service becomes a moment of resonance between the chef and the food and the guest, it becomes magical. Of course, there are grotesque, ego-driven weenie heads making work that resonates, but I think that's almost accidental and won't ultimately become timeless or bring anyone to tears. Work created with strictly transactional motivations like money or power or status can still become very popular, but it's less likely to become truly magical. Work like this usually feels thirsty, which is an obstacle, like all the other obstacles that we'll talk about in the next chapter. If it's not an act of service, if it becomes selfish, its chances of resonating with others plummet. The greatest potential for resonance happens when the work not only outgrows its motive, but also its creator and its audience. I think all great work, any human endeavor, resonates most strongly with us when it becomes an act of service, when the creator and the work and the audience are in resonance, unobstructed by ego. There's no intrinsic value in art or in any other human enterprise until we add the value by adding the magic. It's insufferable, of course, when someone talks about high art or being called to the theater or to tread the boards or serve the muse, using all kinds of flowery language about what a sacrifice they're making for their art. There is nobility there, but it's the same nobility that's intrinsic to any good work. Artists don't have a monopoly, no matter what they tell you while they're being insufferable. I believe that approaching our creative work with humility as a service to others is the most direct path to uncovering the magic in our work. About Ego, Ratatouille, 2007. Author's note. Here in Chapter 4, I'm going to point out some of the obstacles that can prevent us from fully experiencing art and other important things. Over the years, I've been confronted by each of them to some degree, and I hope that spelling them out like this might help you and I see them coming, perhaps empowering both of us to avoid them more effectively the next time they get in our way. Price of admission. Back at the end of Chapter 1, when I was visiting New York's Metropolitan Museum of Art, I was benefiting from tremendous privilege. Lots of folk can't afford the ticket price or can't travel to New York. But sadly, many of us who could afford a ticket or maybe even get one for free don't go to museums because we just don't feel welcome there. Sometimes that can happen when a museum defaults to displaying what's been designated as either cutting edge or historically important, pieces chosen more for their narrative than their intrinsic qualities or whether their curator really likes them or not. And when resonance isn't really a consideration, there's a decreased likelihood for an uninitiated museum visitor to see something they like, and there's an increased danger of their first visit becoming their last. It's one of the many challenges faced by the brave folks who decide what art gets shown in a museum. Baseball is objectively boring when you don't know much about it. But as soon as you understand it just a little bit more, you start to see the nuance, the strategy and poetry that's baked into almost every aspect of it. You'll only start to enjoy the game after you've paid that preliminary intellectual price of admission. Then suddenly you get it and can truly experience the game. And of course, if you don't like baseball, that's okay. It just doesn't resonate. It's not for you. Go watch something else, like curling, if you're a weirdo. Unfortunately, the perceived intellectual ticket price for visiting a museum is often enormous. And sometimes we feel like the art world doesn't only insist that we have to like what it likes, it sometimes feels like it wants us to pay that price of admission in order to like it correctly. If we just like it without doing the homework so we understand why we like it, it doesn't count. That can be very intimidating. If art cannot be appreciated at all without coughing up an intellectual arm and a leg to afford that preliminary ticket price, we're likely to skip the admission altogether. And if we never make it past the museum door, we'll never discover that the art behind that door can resonate with us, regardless of how much homework we may or may not have done. It's freeing to allow our personal taste back into the way we interact with art. I'd never suggest we dismiss anything anyone else likes, but I think it's perfectly fine to skim past less resonant things in favor of more resonant things. Over time, we can always learn more, change our perspective, retune, and revisit later. Gatekeeping. Some gatekeeping is natural, such as needing to know the rules of baseball to fully appreciate the game, or being able to read in the language in which a book is written, or understanding a culture well enough to appreciate work created by that culture. That species of gatekeeping is analogous to the tuning discussed earlier, and it's part of how humans operate. But I think most gatekeeping is artificial, usually unnecessary, ego-driven, and often just plain icky. When a newly minted fan of an indie band gets bullied by the band's longtime fans, or someone is excited to discover a movie only to be disparaged by the fans of the book, or a recipient of a new airbrush gets dismissed when they ask a professional for advice, the world gets a little bit worse. We can become so enamored with a thing we like that we feel entitled to an unhealthy ownership of it, and we resent newcomers. Make no mistake, we are being jerks when we do this, and we should stop. This brand of gatekeeping comes from insecurity, from deriving too much of our personality from the exclusivity of the things we like and do. The idea that everything is a pie and that I lose some if you get some is quite true of actual pie, and I'm, of course, mad about my pie loss. But that's not the way almost anything else works, at least in regards to creative pursuits. If you support a musician, shouldn't you be happy if someone new discovers their music, even or maybe especially if you've been there since they got their start? As an artist, you're guaranteed unhappiness if you compete with anyone other than yourself. And that's true for most creative enterprises. You're, of course, welcome to point out that this is garbage advice when applied to example activity X, and you're absolutely right. I'd simply argue that example activity X is always going to be markedly less fun and resonant than any other activity in which you can push yourself alongside others rather than pushing others down or preventing them from participating at all. When others are joining us in what we like, let's be on the lookout for ways to welcome them in, shall we? It's just another tiny way to improve the world, and there's no harm in trying. In my experience with art education, there was very little space being given to personal taste. We'd compare the works of two different important artists, make observations, and back them up with historical context. But I distinctly remember many instances when I was writing or speaking about art that bored me stiff. As an art major, I did that work, but I'm sure that this aspect of art education must chase a lot of folks away from art as a topic of study, effectively closing the gate. Art that truly resonated with me was glossed over, while art that did nothing for me was elevated, and it always felt a little arbitrary. I'm sure this varies by institution or teacher or any number of other factors, but personally I felt a slow resistance building in which the logical reaction was to keep my opinions to myself and support the accepted narrative, in which important art was treated as such, largely independent of its quality or the degree to which it resonated with me or anyone else. I consider this to be a species of gatekeeping or maybe even gaslighting. It can lead us to distrust our own taste and can really take the fun out of learning about art. I think it would be tremendously helpful if we were always keeping an eye out for positive ways to honor individual perspectives, especially when we're learning about things that each individual sees through their own subjective lens. Museums and galleries are literal gatekeepers, functioning as they do as arbiters of artistic value or importance. They can also highlight lesser known work or provide access to underserved populations. It boils down to the agendas and tastes and egos and philosophies of specific curators or owners or patrons, but museums and galleries play an obvious role in what we see, and they can just as easily prevent access as they can grant it. I think museums are like art zoos. Access to a wide variety of art in one place is a welcome convenience, but nothing beats spotting art in the wild, which is why I like public art. In fact, I think an ideal goal of any art museum should be to let its art free into the world, to get in front of as many eyeballs as possible by breaking down its own walls, figuratively. So sorry to the folks at the Poughkeepsie Museum of Contemporary Art who got an early draft of this book and followed its advice literally. Please donate to their reconstruction fund if you can. Public art, like a mural or sculpture in a park, can be a wide open gate that welcomes everyone into the gallery, or an inscrutable mess that repels the uninitiated. It's an opportunity for positive marketing, for true outreach that benefits an entire community. This is rarely an opportunity for something divisive or controversial because public work is often designed through negotiations between neighbors and artists and funders, so it tends to lean towards style and subject matter that's a little less volatile than the work we might be able to get away with elsewhere. Things can get super weird and wonderful after we've recruited a bunch of new art folks with our highly accessible, easier to digest public art, but it's dangerously easy to cross a line and scare folks off. I have great affection for work that's immediately accessible to anyone, regardless of how they're tuned or trained. It's why I carve pumpkins in sand. Some of my favorite work is utterly unburdened by profundity and can even be downright silly, without falling into blatant dumbness, as discussed in the dumbness section of this chapter, which is only a few hundred words away. Another species of gatekeeping comes from our families, coworkers, and friend groups who can dictate our media diet through direct or indirect criticism or praise. We consciously and subconsciously defer to the opinions of others, whether they're art critics or celebrities or just the folks we interact with every day. We can mess with each other's access to things we like just by how we express ourselves. Whether or not it's intentional, we should all be mindful of the phenomenon and careful with our interpersonal gatekeeping. I like Robert Pirsig's ideas very much, but there's a scene in his Lila, 1990, which bugged me to such a degree that I almost couldn't get past it. The eponymous Lila eagerly shows Pirsig's character an old brochure she saved from a beloved vaudeville show she saw on a riverboat, where they performed classic old songs and told jokes and really entertained the crowd. He then assures her that what she has seen was in fact too much, even labeling it prostitution because it was too calculated, too cliches, or in his terms, static, and therefore lesser than a more original or dynamic performance might have been. He says, people should be themselves, not phony singers on a phony boat. I don't recall precisely which profanities I exclaimed aloud when I first read this, but I invite you to join me now by shouting out your favorite expletives. Here, Pirsig demonstrates what I think is a clumsy misunderstanding of how performing arts and entertainment work. He's commenting on an experience about which he is utterly unqualified to comment because he didn't experience it himself. He ignores Lila's assertion that the show was fantastic, reacting negatively even though his only knowledge of the event is a basic description. Pirsig should have known better. He should have been the first to acknowledge that without experiencing the event itself, without being there, he couldn't possibly know whether or not it was magical. Of course, old source material can be a notch less likely to inspire resonance with someone who happens to be tuned to prefer something new. Nostalgia is tricky indeed. If used clumsily, it can render a performance utterly bland. But can't a truly skilled performer make magic out of anything? When a performer can deeply engage with an old song, resonate with it and with an audience, nostalgia can amplify a magical experience. We've all seen classics spun into gold, whether they were dramatic reinterpretations or faithful re-renderings of a well-known original. The performer was able to connect and resonate with the work and the audience, and the magic was there. Even if Pirsig had seen the show himself and found it to be rehashed garbage, all that would have meant is that the performance wasn't for him. It clearly resonated deeply with Lila, and he was clearly being a jerk for giving her a hard time about it. He could have allowed her to like what she liked and been happy that she enjoyed the show, but instead he managed to take being a jerk to new, jerkier, gatekeepier heights. I give Pirsig credit for being honest enough to include a scene in his book that reveals his own shortcomings, but its stark hypocrisy was hard to digest. In his Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, 1916, James Joyce gatekeeps by calling art proper or improper based on whether or not it induces an ideal aesthetic stasis in which the mind is arrested and raised above kinetic desire and loathing. This is really no fun at all, is it? Pablo Picasso's Guernica reliably makes you angry or sad or both. Stevie Wonder's Superstition forces you to boogie. And for those very reasons, Joyce has decided that neither of those works are proper art. I submit that art can and should do much more than make us calmly nod in appreciation, and that propriety is a mostly useless and moralistic metric. In general, if we find ourselves policing how other folks participate in things, what they like or how they like it, we're most likely in the wrong, and we should go find something else to do, like bake more pie. Note: if you stare too long at Guernica while Superstition is playing, you'll become extremely disoriented and you may need a nap. Commerce. The influence of commerce on great work is usually negative, but not always. In fact, it can be argued that no work being done in modern society is truly free from commercial influence. That often results in soulless junk, but can also generate magic. Just a few hundred years ago, high art was almost entirely confined to churches. The church was the only paying gig in town, the only real patron available to folks like Michelangelo. Non-church art was not even considered art. It would be called craft or folk art or possibly heresy, depending on geography and politics and the number of hundreds of years ago. The separation between church art and non-art was largely a class separation, not just about religion, but about upper and lower class, and what was to be consumed by very rich people or high-ranking members of the church versus the poorer class, the general public. Entertainment of the non-church variety was very low art indeed, driven by irredeemable smut peddlers like William Shakespeare. Eventually, the church no longer had the market cornered, and another paradigm arose in which rich folks could also become patrons of artists, placing them on the payroll with a full-time salary, which became a fashionable way to demonstrate immense wealth. Art was still exclusive and elevated and separated from the masses, but it no longer had to adhere to strictly churchy subject matter. As Western society became more Western and more societal, the folks who wanted to make money figured out that they could do that by making things that everyone wanted to see, not just rich folks. Entertainment as an industry grew steadily, largely overshadowing the influence of high art in favor of popularity, of what people will pay to see. More and more, investors began to drive entertainment, and to this day, commerce drives entertainment more than any other single factor. But here's the thing. The magic, or at least the potential for it, is still there. Nowadays, with commerce firmly in the driver's seat, art and entertainment are functionally indistinguishable. Folks talk about entertainment that's really amazing becoming art, as though there's a standard threshold it has to cross to receive the designation. But at the core, it's all the same. We think something's great when it resonates with us. I'd argue that since entertainment is generally louder than visual art, it's more likely to achieve that resonance. But the entertainment industry is indeed where most of the art is hiding nowadays. That's why I tend to use the words art and entertainment and work interchangeably, because I think the divisions between them are almost completely irrelevant. Great work is made every day out of garbage source material because folks dig in and do great work in the face of their limitations. Great source material is also turned to garbage every day by folks who just don't care much about it. The potential for resonance, and therefore success, is more about personal values or an atmosphere of shared love for the work than it is about the intrinsic qualities of any given project. Of course, the goals of making money and making good things are often at odds, but not always. If you're chasing success measured by popularity alone and have the resources, you can always generate lowest common denominator, test marketed work that's very easy for the public to digest and which will likely be very popular. That's okay. You can also take a well-funded bad idea and make it into art by finding the resonance. That's okay too. There's room for all of it. We've seen big budget flops that are objectively bad and big budget successes that are actually good and vice versa. The playing field is by no means level in Hollywood or anywhere else for that matter, but there's resonance to be found anywhere humans are doing good work. A movie is a giant team effort in constant danger of becoming polluted by strictly commerce-driven forces that will impede the resonance. When a project fails, it's almost always because it feels too thirsty and falls short of its potential. But if we're lucky, that movie will have people involved who truly want to do good work so that the magic does appear in spite of the commercial influence. We can truly immunize ourselves to the icky parts of commercialism by simply allowing ourselves a little autonomy in what we consume and enjoy. Recognizing that everything is on the same continuum also frees us up to appreciate certain aspects of work without falling in love with it as a whole. A terrible movie almost always has at least a few redeeming qualities, and no blockbuster is without its flaws. To accept all of that is to release some of the external pressure we feel to relegate art we really like to guilty pleasure status, or to force ourselves to pretend to like things we might not actually like. How's this for a guiding principle? Only buy it if you actually like it. That's actual free market capitalism, isn't it? Hollywood would probably collapse if we all went with that principle, and some of our most highly paid celebrities might have to rethink their stock portfolios, but the resonance-driven utopia that would eventually rise from the mayhem might just enable a few more artists to pay their rent stress-free. Dumbness. Conceptual art is not inherently dumb, but it's always at extremely high risk of becoming so. It always makes me bristle a little when the concept or theory of the art is more important than the finished piece, and that's largely what Tom Wolfe objected to. That said, I have seen plenty of work you would call conceptual that's lots of fun to look at. I'd therefore argue that conceptual art is only usually dumb. When it's not dumb, for me, it's because some tangible, skilled work is involved in making the thing. The way I'm tuned means the cards are stacked against me resonating with something that relies too heavily on its idea without being balanced by some skill and execution. Perhaps the work was easy to make but hard to conceptualize, or the pure idea could be expressed elegantly by only slightly influencing some real-world object. But in that case, did I really need to see this thing at all? Or could you have just told me about it to equal effect? Could you have just written the idea down and let me read it? Author's note. Okay, here's where I'm going to get hypocritical and betray my deeply held belief that we should try to allow ourselves to like what we like and make an effort not to judge others for what they like. That's because, regardless of its dumbness or lack thereof, usually no harm can be done by any single work of art. We can simply ignore what doesn't resonate with us and move on to work that does. However, high-profile and profoundly stupid situations like those described below make me feel deeply icky. Therefore, I wholeheartedly embrace the hypocrisy of my condemnation of each and every participant in the weenie-headedness described below. The art business itself is often quite silly, and when it's at its silliest, we're all doing ourselves a disservice by not acknowledging that silliness. We leave that up to folks like Jens Hanning, who sold a blank canvas for $84,000 and entitled the work Take the Money and Run, and to Maurizio Catalan, who got over $6 million for his installation entitled Comedian, which is a banana duct taped to a gallery wall. Crumpled paper, work number 88, Martin Creed, 1995, assigned urinal, fountain, Marcel Duchamp, 1917. The list goes on. It's all the same deeply cynical hack joke, one that's been told over and over, often for stupidly inflated paychecks. Stunts like this get a lot of press, and the public rolls its collective eyes, and there's no one doing a good job counteracting the dumbness because no explanation will do the trick. It's a banana, duct tape, to a wall. This kind of work is often used as an excuse not to fund art programs because it's such an easy target. So when we find ourselves promoting or defending it, above the countless other things we should be promoting and defending, I worry that we're acting against our own best interests. When we reflexively make the argument that a dumb thing is not dumb because it's art, we lose that argument. Our valiant defense of the duct tape banana is nearly as silly as the banana itself. Instead, as artists and art fans, I think we should all be prepared to acknowledge that some art is dumb without letting the dumb stuff become the public-facing representative of the entire art world. That's because when a real artist asks for a fair price for their real art, the duct tape banana's price tag is looming in the collective subconscious, reminding everyone that art is stupid and costs too much. These statement pieces made by the duct tapers and urinal signers fuel a pervasive cynicism that keeps many folks away from art. Of course, we could use the duct tape banana as a springboard for a deep philosophical discussion about what art is and why it's art and who's really an artist and why. Was Duchamp performing a revolutionary act of recontextualization when he uncapped that black marker back in 1917 to sign his urinal? Did that act really make the urinal into art? Maybe, but that question doesn't matter much to me because I don't resonate with the object or even the question. Am I just being defensive? Could I be reacting negatively to this brand of satire because I take it personally? I don't really think so, both because I don't pretend that anything is immune to criticism, and I've never been much of a lavatorial signatory. I get the joke, I just don't find it funny. Notorious clock melter Salvador Dali was also making fun of his art, and himself and everyone else, but he did it with such skill that it always worked for me. Apparently, he and Duchamp of the signed urinal were great pals. And while Duchamp also generated a whole lot of other art that took a whole lot of effort, I'm still kind of mad at him for signing that urinal. I think he may have single-handedly created the permission structure that fed into our collective cynicism, leading to Catalan's Comedian and countless other modern acts of metaphorical urinal signing. I can't really begrudge any of these jokesters for cheating at such a silly game, but I do believe they're making the world a little worse, harming other folks who are trying to play the silly game fairly by actually make things they care deeply about. You have been listening to Low Art, High Craft, and Exquisite Spatulas, written and read by Mike Craighead, copyright 2025. Visit lowarthighcraft.com for print, ebook, and other formats. Music by Mike and by Melanie Fangs, that's with a Z. For more music, visit mikecraighead.com and melaniefangs.bandcamp.com, respectively.